I'm very optimistic that once we get folks in the room, I think you're going to be surprised. Because one thing about this, having done this a long time, it's slow, and then it moves very quickly.
Senator Mark Warner joins us now. Hello, Senator.
Hey, Jen. Hey, Renato. Thank you for having me on, and hope you guys are doing good.
Thanks for being on. Now, let's get right into it. The industry came to you to push for the House-passed market structure bill. There's been a little bit of back and forth. We had some discussions yesterday with the industry, as we were just speaking about with our last guest. What are some of your takeaways from the discussions yesterday?
Well, I think a lot of my colleagues had on the Democratic side, a pretty high level of frustration. And I think the meeting was net very positive. I think there was, one of the things we wanted to share, particularly a lot of the crypto folks, are relatively new to politics. And the idea that 18 of us, and I was intimately involved in the Genius bill up to my eyeballs, kind of broke with what had been kind of the more traditional Democratic view on crypto and said, no, I'm a believer. This is a critically important industry. We've got to make sure we have the vast majority of it here in America, and we got to have American technology leadership. And I think, while there is always nitpicking after the fact, I think the Genius bill has gotten so far pretty darn good reviews. And what the frustration then came is, we went against what was the majority of the Democrats in the Senate. And we said, we got to get this done. And then we moved right after that to market structure. And, we frankly think we saw a little bit of bad faith when some documents were leaked to the industry, and the industry then, without picking up the phone and saying, hey, some of this stuff on this document, and matter of fact, I got to tell you, I had not even seen the document before it went out, seems kind of crazy. Instead, the industry went and started publicly blasting folks. And, and Kristen, I'm not saying Kristen by any means herself, but, she knows how the rhythms of the Senate work, and, that doesn't build trust. But I think it was a very positive meeting yesterday. I think we all feel a sense of urgency. I would just say at the front end, let me make two quick other comments. One is that for many of us, and, my background was all in technology for, 30 plus years, 25 plus years before I got involved in politics. I reminded some of the younger members that, when we talk about American leadership, I was building a cell phone industry in the early 80s, and then was very involved in software companies were building up the internet, and obviously everything related, telecom writ large. That DeFi particularly, it's really complicated. And market structure is exponentially more complicated than stablecoin. So some of this is not slow, but just fully getting this. And I acknowledge that the industry, and my good friend Kirsten Gillibrand, she's very familiar with this. She's years ahead of most of the rest of us. So we're still learning. And then there was a little bit of a mixed message from industry, because a whole lot of industry leaders said, man, this is the most complicated stuff, and you guys got to learn it, and it really is hard. And then in the very next breath, other members would say, but we got to get it done yesterday. And if we accept the premise that this blockchain technology writ large, crypto is an essential component of that, all of the positive outcomes come from that, getting it right, in my mind, is so important. And we're not talking about, months more. We got to get our staffs back in the room. I'm not going to set an arbitrary timeline, because that's how we get crappy product. But I can tell you from my office standpoint and my personal belief, we got to get this done. It's got to be bipartisan. I do think it's one of the reasons why the Ag Committee is taking a little bit longer, because I think they are writing the bill in a bipartisan fashion, which is, frankly, a much fairer and better process than having a partisan-only bill out there that you somehow then have to pick and choose where to amend. I've done a lot of these. I've been in more bipartisan gangs than any member in the Senate, and you got a hell of a lot better product when you write it jointly than when you take a partisan product and then try to amend it.
Senator, you talked a little bit about the traditional Democratic view. Obviously, in many ways, federal regulation of emerging technology is a traditional Democratic view as well, and having a federal regulatory framework. How are you and others like Senator Gillibrand bringing along change in the Democratic Party's perspective, and where do you see the party positioning itself regarding crypto in the months to come in the next election cycle?
Well, first of all, as somebody who I think I may have crossed over, I've been in elected office longer than I was a business guy, but I was a tech business guy for decades. And I do think, there has been a charge that is too often true that Democrats were overly regulatory. And there's this constant tension between, protecting people and opportunity. And we may have slid, and I fight that battle on not just in crypto, but in a whole series of domains, number one. Number two, I do think, and this is kind of where we get into both, asset definition and who will be lead regulators. We don't want to create and reinvent, all of the consumer protections that exist in the securities field. We do understand that many of these items will look a lot more like commodities, and there'll be spot markets you created and secondary markets created, and that still we've got to get right. But as somebody that, again, I go back to when cell phones and wireless was really cool and cutting edge in the 80s. When I first got involved in technology, I started a company called Nextel, started a big VC. If we hadn't had federal preemption, wireless would have never become what it's become. So I get the notion that we need one set of rules and not 50 set of rules, but we got to then make sure the rules at the federal level make sense.
I want to come back to this leaked document that you brought up just a few minutes ago. It was a leaked DeFi proposal from the Democrats. You mentioned that the industry has had a negative response to it. One of the responses was from Uniswap CEO Hayden Adams. He posted on X, quote, "Senate Dems want to kill DeFi entirely." It doesn't sound like that's the case from what you're saying here, but I would like to give you the chance to respond to comments like this. What do you say to these industry CEOs who feel that way?
Well, again, I like Hayden. I've met with him a number of times. He was in the meeting yesterday. I did remind him that I've been doing tech stuff for, unfortunately, to acknowledge this, over 40 years. I know Hayden's not. I think he's going to hit 30 shortly, and which is great that he's got these new ideas. And this is the first time he's been involved in a political process. And again, on the so-called document, I can tell you this: I hadn't seen it. It was a group of 12 offices sending something over as a starting discussion point. And again, it was bad faith that it was leaked. And I would have wished that Hayden or others would have, called me or called some of the other offices and say, some of this stuff here is kind of crazy. And let me tell you why, as opposed to blasting, commentary without even saying, well, what's your basis here? Isn't this crazy? And some of the notion that he has that, things like folks that write code or validators or somehow are going to be swept in, he's just wrong. He's just wrong. So, and again, I think we're in a much better place now. We got to get our staffs back in the room. We got to, work through this. It's frankly, I think it is imminently doable. There are some complex issues. Again, I go back to, there was one comment about smart contracts in the room that one individual from the industry said, well, we should do XYZ with this. And one of my colleagues said, well, do you all agree with that? And 2/3 of the CEOs said, holy heck, no, don't, that's totally not the case. So with this, there's still tensions within the industry. This is evolving so quickly. We got to get it right. It can be both things. It can be extraordinarily important, but also extraordinarily complex. And I've been doing this stuff long enough. Rushed, faulty, bad legislation. The very people in the room who want it done yesterday will live to rue that day. And if we don't end up, and just by the nature of the Senate, it's going to have to be bipartisan. But I'd love to keep the 18 senators we had on stablecoin, on Genius, and actually see if we can grow that number, because that will give the industry the long-term assurance that I think they're looking for, and that otherwise, if it still is we had about a third of the Democrats in the Senate, I'd like to see if we can improve on that number.
So you had talked a few moments ago, Senator, about the importance of protecting the public and protecting consumers and so on. One important piece of that is having the regulatory agencies appropriately funded and staffed. Now, there have been some reductions, serious reductions at the CFTC and the SEC as of late. I know that there was a document you had signed on to, a number of senators had, and one of the issues that was mentioned was increased appropriations. How, do you see that coming out of this process, increased appropriations for the SEC and the CFTC?
If we all agree that crypto blockchain at all is going to try transform finance, and if we all agree, and particularly the industry I know has a little more shifting now, but as you guys acknowledged earlier, they were much more pro CFTC a while back, but CFTC is going to have a big role. You got to have folks that are nimble enough, knowledgeable enough, because I can tell you any legislation is going to leave most of the details to the regulators. And one of the things I made, clear to the White House, and I've had good engagement with the White House on this, is that, we got to make sure that not only the CFTC has appropriate funding, but it's got Democratic commissioners as well. I mean, it's kind of hard for me to go to the, and we know some of the folks who are very much opposed to this effort on the Democratic side, and say, gosh, let's do this, when somebody will say, well, hold on, we don't even have a Democratic member on the regulating body at this point, which is, by the way, the law. You're supposed to have, majority and minority representation. I think the White House gets that. And, while there's not an immediate, there's one of the Democrats on the SEC cycles off in a period. We got to make sure we've got a appropriate, informed, funded regulators, because again, I buy into the notion that this has the potential to be huge. Already is huge, but it has the potential to be exponentially larger, and Lord knows we got to do it here. And if we set the right rules, the rest of the world will follow.
Senator, both you and our previous guest, Kristen, mentioned this education gap when it comes to DeFi in Washington. What do you think needs to happen to close that gap?
Well, I think, and the industry is getting better at kind of reaching out and making the case, but the notion of a truly decentralized entity, when you've got questions of control and questions of custody and who's contributing, and this is gnarly stuff. I'm a tech guy, and it's taken me time to get my head wrapped around it. I do think, having a tech background and a business background, I think the more I think I can be very helpful getting other Democrats. I think most folks would acknowledge that, we got, I was, again, very active on the Genius bill, and I, Kirsten had taken the lead, but I think she would acknowledge as well, we got a lot more Democrats than where we were starting at. So I think hopefully I can play that constructive role again. But it's hard. And again, one of the things I think that's been kind of bubbling beneath, and please don't trust me, but you ought to independently check in with a bunch of Senate Republicans on the banking committee who've been quietly coming to me and saying, Mark, we don't kind of fully understand this stuff either. So, and that's not, and what I beg the industry to hear is, that's not trying to slow things down. It's not trying to drag this out. It's trying to acknowledge that, in a field that, there was some debate going back as who is longest in the industry at the roundtable yesterday, but it's still, it doesn't have a 30-year history. And then for a lot of folks, it's hard and they haven't taken the time. I think everybody's taken the time right now. And I want to get this done as quickly as reasonably possible. And I don't think that most of the issues, frankly, even break down on a traditional liberal conservative background. It's much more of who's going to be, this is a future past deal. Again, Kristen said a little bit, it doesn't mean we got to break all of the past structure, but it does mean you got to be thinking about these issues that don't fit in traditional boxes here. And boy, oh boy, particularly DeFi, I'm a hell of a lot smarter on it today than I was 90 days ago, and much smarter than I was 30 days ago. I'm doing a deep dive.
All right, Senator, we do got to go, but I want to quickly ask you, you said as quickly as reasonably possible. I acknowledge you said you don't want to put a timeline on it, but I got to ask anyways. What are you thinking? As quickly as reasonably possible. What does that mean? 6 months, a year?
Let's get the Democratic and Republican staff members back in the room. And, all of these deals I've been in, you got to get most of it done with staff, and then the members got to come in. We had, I think it was an 8 or 10 hour session that, at least on the Democratic side, it was me and Ruben Gallego and Angela Alsobrooks and Kirsten, sat with Bill Haggerty and particularly Cynthia Lummis, and the chairman came in and out, but that wouldn't have been successful if we hadn't done the preliminary work. And when my Republican friends say, "Well, gosh, we don't even want to meet with you guys until you set a date," that seems to me to be backwards. We, because of this snafu on with this document getting out and being leaked again by the Republicans, we lost 2 weeks. That was a shame. Let's get them back in the room. Like this is, I don't want to sound like I'm a broken record. This is kind of like the same pitch I'm making right now. Please, President Trump, don't go to Asia. Put it off for a day. Sit down and let's get the government reopened, and let's get the healthcare cliff avoided. You're the great deal maker. We can do it in a couple hours.
Senator, on that note, thank you very much for joining us today. It was a pleasure.
I hope you did notice I didn't give you a definitive timeline.
I sure did.
not your first rodeo, not my first rodeo, but I am very optimistic that once we get folks in the room, I think you're going to be surprised. Because one thing about this, having done this a long time, it's slow, and then it moves very quickly.
Senator, thank you very much. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you.